This video truly restores all the details of the Battle of Iwo Jima, 20,000 the first Japanese 110,000 US military suffered heavy losses. The United States later had to use the atomic bomb. In February 1945, the United States sent more than 600 warships, carrying 70,000 US troops to a landing operation on Iwo Jima. After 7 days of fighting, the US military finally captured the southern area of Iwo Jima. The 25th of February 1945, the US military decided to launch an all-out offensive to the north of Iwo Jima, planning to capture the northern airport first, then continue to the north of the airport to the high ground until the sea. At 6:30 in the morning, mortars carried out a round of fire coverage first, and tanks pressed the array. With the advance of the infantry, most American troops thought it would be an easy fight. But what I didn't expect was that the US infantry had just passed through the northern airport when they were violently returned by Japanese mortars. At that time, there were heavy casualties. Even if tanks were sent to cover, it did not play a big role, because the Japanese had already deployed anti-tank artillery positions on the northeast ridge. 5 US Sherman tanks were destroyed in an instant, but this was only a small dish. Next, the US military will experience the most painful battle since World War II, because if you want to attack the Japanese, you must first cross the mountain plateau, which is a flat area without any bunkers. On all sides are towering cliffs, the road is rugged, easy to defend, and difficult to attack. It was very beneficial to the Japanese army, and there was also a small shirt called 382 heights on the right wing of the airport. The hill had been hollowed out by the Japanese and reinforced with concrete, with a large number of artillery and bunkers deployed around it. It has formed an airtight crossover network of firepower, which can hardly move the US military suppression. There is no breakthrough in all directions, and the two sides can only stand in a stalemate here, and the left wing of the airport also has a less steep stretch of high ground. The Japanese are on this high ground. It also dug up a large number of channels and fought a tug-of-war with the US military by virtue of its geographical advantage. Even though the battle here is still extremely difficult for the US military, it has become the only breakthrough at the moment. So in the next few days, Japan and the United States launched a war of attrition around the airport from all directions. Although the Japanese army blocked the US attack by virtue of its geographical advantage, it did not have subsequent supplies. Food and ammunition are rapidly depleted, then slowly into the decline. The US military has finally paid a huge price. After occupying the high ground overflowing from the airport, the US troops immediately sent a wing crew forward from the rugged path behind the highland, hoping to find a road that can penetrate to the back of the Japanese army. The team moved cautiously through the maze of gullies. Just entering a small canyon, it was found on the shore by Japanese snipers, and in a short time many American troops were knocked down. As the Japanese were an absolute geographical advantage, the US military had to call in naval gunfire support. However, this round of shelling also caused 2 deaths to the US military, so they had to retreat back. On the other hand, after several days of brutal fighting, the US military has paid more than 50% of the casualties. Finally attacked the 382 heights, and the Japanese launched a tug-of-war. At this time hidden 382 heights near the Japanese Communications Center, there were 7 Japanese correspondents who made contact with mainland Japan. There was no follow-up news of reinforcements. With this news, the system Japanese army took advantage of the night to go to the large force. They interspersed in the middle of the battlefield, advancing through the cover of tank wreckage and corpses. But I didn't expect to be discovered by the US military's flare soon, and then it was a shot. 6 Japanese troops were killed directly, and the last Japanese army was seriously injured, finally bringing this desperate news to the Japanese army and the US side, because the Japanese have been relying on bunkers and tunnels to fight. So air and sea bombing has not been very effective. However, the anti-tank gun positions on the left and right flanks of high ground were pulled out. The pressure on the tanks was abruptly reduced, so the US military had a new tactic. They brought in fire-breathing tanks. To deal with the Japanese hiding in the cave, I didn't think the effect was excellent, so I formed a special combat team with main battle tanks and fire tanks. First, the main battle tanks blasted a hole against the Japanese bunkers, and then the fire-breathing tanks sprayed flames against the hole. This method of stewing pigs in the oven not only caused heavy losses to the Japanese army, but also did not have a good way to deal with it. As a result, the US military quickly broke through the main defense line of the Japanese army and occupied most of the Benshan Plateau. But in the northeast, there's also a 362 high ground, which always stands there like a nail. It blocked the steps of the US military, whether it was artillery coverage or infantry charges. They failed to win, but they paid a very heavy price. As a last resort, the US can only change tactics. At 5 o'clock in the morning on March the 7th, an assault force composed of 2 US military regiments give up the cover of artillery fire so quietly touched up as they approached the first Japanese line of defense. However, they found that the Japanese troops inside were still sleeping, so they solved the problem with bayonets. Then he moved on, but was spotted by a bunker not far away, and launched an attack on the US military. Although the bunker was quickly disposed of by the US Spitfires, the gunfire awakened the Japanese at the top of the mountain. The two sides immediately launched a fierce exchange of fire. Due to the sudden incident, the Japanese army failed to organize effective resistance. The mountain was soon occupied by the American army. As commanders, after learning the news, I was ecstatic, but I was not happy for long. When it was dawn, I found that the US army had rushed to the wrong place. What was won was the 331 Highland, and the 362 Highland was still firmly controlled by the Japanese army. The US troops were held down at the bottom of the mountain and could not move. Seeing this, the US troops 331 on the high ground immediately launched an advance from the flank to the 362 high ground. In order to attract Japanese firepower, the American troops in the southern part of the 362 Highlands launched a desperate charge. Marching under Japanese fire, soon this death squad of 200 US troops. In the end, only 5 people were left. Fortunately, under the attack of both sides, they finally won the 362 Heights. After successfully capturing the 331 and 362 Heights, the Japanese defenses were compressed to the limit. But there are still many scattered Japanese troops hidden in various bunkers and caves on Iwo Jima. These Japanese troops fell into despair when they learned that there were no reinforcements. There is part of the Japanese army decided to launch the final long-life charge, hoping to die with the American army with explosives. Soon, 1,000 Japanese troops organized themselves and decided to send towards Mansurabad's suicide charge. When they had just gathered near 382 Heights, it was discovered by the US military's flare and soon ushered in the US military's artillery decision. Most of the Japanese troops died under the artillery attack. The surviving Japanese troops continued to advance under fire. Soon after, they found out there was another team of 400 Japanese soldiers hiding in the crater ahead. After the two sides converged, after a short break, they resumed the suicide charge towards the US military. On the other side, there was a Japanese army trying to advance to the airport, but it was suppressed by the US army. As a last resort, you can only evacuate backwards. Soon after, they suddenly found a quiet cave. There were also several Japanese soldiers who were alone. After communication, the two sides decided to hide here together until the night of the end of the battle. Except for this escaped Japanese army, all other Japanese troops that launched the charge were wiped out. After that night, the morale of the remaining Japanese army plummeted, and the US army finally ushered in a turning point in the battle. On March the 9th, the US military relied on the geographical advantage of the 362 Highlands. It pushed the front to the northeast coast, dividing the Japanese defense into two parts. Let the Japanese defense system appeared loopholes. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the US military finally took the 382 Heights. Because of the loss of 382 Heights, the Japanese army's southern defense system completely collapsed. It was no longer possible to resist the US advance, and with the loss of the southern line of defense, the northern line of defense did not last long. The defeat of the Japanese army was a foregone conclusion, and then a large number of fire-breathing tanks were sent to the front. Make the final cleanup of the Japanese army. Facing this desperate situation, every morning of March the 26th, the Supreme Commander of the Japanese army came to Shongdao and personally led the 350 remaining Japanese troops. A final counterattack was launched against the American forces, who passed through Death Valley and headed toward the second airfield. Along the way, he escaped several US military outposts, and unknowingly touched a US military camp on the edge of the airport. It then divided into 3 formations and surrounded the sleeping US military camp. With a quick order, the Japanese roared and launched a suicide attack on the US military camp. The sound of gunfire alarmed the surrounding US troops. Rescue soon came. The two sides launched a fierce battle. With absolute superiority in numbers and weapons, the Japanese were quickly wiped out, including the commander's visit to China daily. The entire army was wiped out, while the US army suffered 172 casualties. March the 26th, the US military announced the complete conquest of Iwo Jima. On this small island of only 20 square kilometers, the United States and Japan fought for 36 days with 23,786 Japanese troops. In the end, only 1,083 people survived and all the rest were killed, while the total number of US military casualties was 28,686. 110,000 US military against the 20,000 Japanese army, but also in the case of full-scale crushing by sea, land and air. The casualties of the US military were actually higher than of the Japanese, which also led to the US military not carrying out landing operations on the Japanese mainland.